Earth Foreigners Revealed: The Two Ancient Elites That Rule the World, Part 1, by Burke Goomis. November 7th, 2023.
There were essentially two surviving elites from that very ancient interplanetary warfare of Atlantis. A good elite, wishing to restore to humanity in its entirety the benefits of the civilization destroyed in that war, and a bad elite, wishing to restore all the technological instruments of its own hegemony, and essentially to enslave the rest of mankind by means of them, and for the purposes of once again marching out into space in an orgy of conquest. In the Contact Report 831, it is reported that the today's ancestors of the so-called Earth foreigners, who can be observed in earthly airspace with their UFOs, helped the ancient Minoans to produce remarkable buildings, ornaments, and so on. In the article, The Earth Foreigners and the Minoan Religion, I showed that the Minoans undoubtedly worshipped a female goddess who is also seen on many of their ornaments, etc., most likely representing the ancestors of today's Earth foreigners. As already explained in that article, this Minoan female goddess, also called the solar goddess, is exclusively depicted as sitting, often together with a younger god who is always depicted standing, symbolizing a mother-son relationship.
Minoan solar goddess with her son.
This visual formula of the seated goddess and the standing male god, respectively the symbolization of a mother-son relationship, is not limited to Crete. There were similar belief structures in other cultures and countries, like Sumer, Egypt, China, India, and Mesoamerica, which eventually led to the modern depiction of the Virgin Mary.
Babylon. Egypt. India. Mesoamerica. China. Virgin Mary.
Excerpt from The Earth Foreigners and the Minoan Religion.
The male pharaoh of Egypt, Akhenaten, who is often called a heretic king because he introduced monotheism, did not feminize the god because the god was abstract. God was only the sun disk, that's all. There was no gender. But he was the representative of that god, and he feminized himself and made himself look almost androgynous, to show that a god is made up of both genders together.
And exactly in this mother-son duality, or the idea that God is made up of both genders together, like the example of the pharaoh Akhenaten, we have also something similar as mentioned above in Sumer, China, India, and also Mesoamerica.
Androgynous form of Akhenaten. Androgynous form of Shiva.
To put it more simply, the descendants of today's Earth foreigners consists most likely of Minoan, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, also Tibetan, Japanese, Norse, and Meso, American gods like Enlil, Shamash, Horus, Osiris, Shiva, Kali, Quetzalcoatl, Huitzilopochtli, etc., just to name a few. It is not a coincidence that all these cultures had sun deities, or were worshipping the sun, as it is also no coincidence that the inhabitants of Agartha, the blue-skinned gods of India, call themselves the sons of the sun.
Excerpt from Contact Report 856.
But that is not all. For my father wrote, And this is what I want to speak to you about specifically. Namely, that you also made studies concerning the foreigners and observed many things for this purpose in very ancient times, and that they not only erected very great buildings by sound vibrations, but also brought medical knowledge to Earth. But these have been lost and forgotten in the course of the millennia that have passed, just as the great foreigners Horus, Danvantari, Thor, etc. have been.
As far as the Aztecs were concerned, their civilization, like the Egyptians' views of their civilization an ocean away, was a legacy received whole cloth from Quetzalcoatl. As if to reinforce this idea of common motifs spread over the planet and dispersed among distinct cultures, one can also observe a number of peculiar parallels between Quetzalcoatl and the Egyptian god Osiris. Like Osiris, Quetzalcoatl was buried in a sarcophagus, whence he was resurrected to ascend into heaven to become a star. But there is one catch in the whole thing. These gods are again divided within themselves into two different camps, or two different elites, and it is these two elites which are the origin within esoteric and occult tradition of the idea of two brotherhoods and two paths. The White Brotherhood, emphasizing the right-hand path of love, peace, harmony, white magic, virtue, and tolerance, and the Black Brotherhood, pursuing the left-hand path of violence, chaos, black magic, social engineering, and the occult inclusive of blood sacrifices. Basically, it's like the main theme in Star Wars, the Force versus... It would be interesting to know that Enlil, the main god of the Sumerian and Akkadian pantheon, is depicted on a relief from the time of the Elamian king Tepti-Humban in Shushinak, with his wife Ninlil, with an imitation of the old peace symbol, which was still known at the time of King Inshushinak, and found a modified imitation of the peace symbol as Tree of Peace and Tree of Life. See Contact Report 559. One mechanism and technique for the engineering of social cohesion was the introduction of religion, and in particular, monotheistic religion requiring absolute, unquestioned obedience. Religion, on this view, becomes that principal technique of social engineering, and, read a certain way, parallels the institutionalized terrorism of the great revolutions in modern times, demanding unquestioned obedience to theocratic authority on pain of death. The institution of human sacrifice was a component not only of this program, but also kind of collateralization of humanity to certain types of monetary policy that began to emerge in ancient times, and that in some cases was also a component of social engineering via religion. The most telltale sign of the activities and orientations of these two post-war elites arises in connection with ancient monetary policy and financial structures. If the goal was to jumpstart civilization as quickly as possible, not only was commerce necessary, and therewith an accurate and reproducible system of geodetically based weights and measures, but a medium of exchange was also necessary to facilitate it. Here, as in modern times, two philosophies of money arose, each backed by their respective elite. Money was a receipt on the surplus goods and services, that is to say, on the gross domestic product of the state itself, and thus was issued by the state debt-free as an instrument of exchange. This activity and philosophy represented the policies of the good elite, seeking to democratize the benefits of civilization as widely and quickly as possible. It is a policy mirror, in some cases, by a peculiar attitude of some of the gods to the idea of sacrifice. Money was monetized debt, that is to say, an instrument of exchange loaned into circulation at interest by private monopolies, thus creating a closed economic system where there is never enough money in circulation to pay the interest on the principal. This creates scarcity and led to the most useful tool of social engineering and private profiteering, way-are. This financial policy and activity reflects the interests and agenda of the bad elite, and thus the notion of blood sacrifices and debt are also deeply entangled with it. One need only glance at these chronological layers and at certain ancient texts, and to take those texts seriously, to see the activity of these elites at work behind the scenes, manipulating social policy and culture at the minimum, and attempting to manipulate the physical medium itself by means of their surviving technologies and techniques. The activity may be glimpsed at the following account from the Aztec Codex Chimalpopoca. Well, it is told and related that many times during the life of Quetzalcoatl, sorcerers tried to ridicule him into making the human payment, into taking human lives. But he always refused. He did not consent because he greatly loved his subjects, who were Toltecs. Snakes, birds, and butterflies that he killed were what his sacrifices always were. And it is told and related that with this he wore out the sorcerer's patience. So it was then that they started to ridicule him and make fun of him, the sorcerers saying they wanted to torment Quetzalcoatl and make him run away. And it became true. It happened. Then they tell how Quetzalcoatl departed. It was when he refused to obey the sorcerers about making the human payment, about sacrificing humans. Then the sorcerers deliberated among themselves, they whose names were Tezcatlipoca, Ihuimacatl, and Toltecatl. They said, he must leave his city. We shall live there.
Note what we have in this passage.
God King, in this case Quetzalcoatl, who refuses to institute a certain policy demanded by an elite, sorcerers, who then determine to depose Quetzalcoatl and drive him from the capital, and take possession of it and of the symbols of authority in order to institute its social policy. In other words, taken at face value, the God King Quetzalcoatl represents the public face of a more hidden elite, and when the policies of the two come into conflict, he must be deposed. Notably, this suggests that Quetzalcoatl represents one elite, the White Brotherhood, while the sorcerers represent the Black Brotherhood, or better known from the contact reports as the Bafath or Giza intelligences.
Excerpt from Contact Report 055.
Quetzalcoatl appears to be understood by the Aztecs to be a titular name, the name of an office as much as it is the name of person, and office similar in nature to the Mayans' description, sovereign plumed serpent, or if we again draw the comparison to the Star Wars movies, similar to the title Jedi.
I can answer the second question by no, nor do any of Quetzal's forefathers belong to Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl had been, in Earth terms, a very high officer, or a high supervisor of an extraterrestrial group, which was active in the region you today call Egypt. But he was very knowledgeable and wise, and thus was often assigned special missions, of which one brought him to South America, where he became venerated as a god by the Aztecs. Since he owned a small ship, this impression of the Aztec people was strengthened, but this was not his intention. When he first met together with another commissioner, a certain Huitzilopochtli, he changed his conduct. Huitzilopochtli was one of the leading Giza intelligences, and he exercised a bloody sacrifice-based rulership over the Aztecs. He was insatiable in this respect, and demanded human blood as sacrifice, while Quetzalcoatl was against such. Thus an evil enmity rose between them, and each of them sought to gain leadership over the peoples. By wicked deceit and deceptive machinations, Huitzilopochtli succeeded in expelling Quetzalcoatl, in consequence of which he fled and returned to Egypt.
Other members of the so-called White Brotherhood could be perhaps the long-lived and highly motivated society that referred to its initiates in ancient Egypt as the followers of Horus, also known as the Shemsu Hor, or in ancient India the so-called Seven Rishis, sea-lynx.
The activity of the elites and the meaning of the term grid.
Nobody sets out to build 50,000 plus pyramids and mounds around a planet just for the hell of it, or want of something to do. History teaches that these primitive people were hunter-gatherers who spent their waking hours running down their next meals. If that's true, then who built these monuments? These people didn't have the time. These things were not built at the whims of medicine men. There was enormous global planning behind it all.
Carl P. Monk, what exactly is the Earth grid?
The term grid refers to ancient sites, temples, and structures that lie upon a specific grid whose significance is determined by their placement at mathematically significant places upon the surface of the Earth, or in correspondence with celestial astronomical alignments, or both, and often incorporate these and also other mathematical analogus in the structures themselves. The placement of certain types of megalithic monuments at certain places on the surface of the Earth, an activity that upon close examination transcends the cultures to whom such activities are normally attributed. The transcendence of this activity across times and disparate cultures thus only emphasizes its peculiar nature. Like it or not, we are in the presence of a unified religio-scientific subculture propping up the more tangible cultures that allegedly produce these structures. This implies a measure of coordination and contact, and points to the hidden problems with the modern academic assumptions of diffusionism and the evolution of civilizations. It is one thing to maintain, for example, that certain sites in Great Britain, Stonehenge, Silbury Hill, the Avebury Circles, the Rollright Circle of Oxfordshire, and so on, are situated according to a discernible and definite pattern or grid upon the topography of that country. But it is quite another thing when that activity is also being done by Mesoamerican Mayans, or South American Incas, or ancient Egyptians, or primitive Teutons, or modern Freemasons, laying out Washington, D.C., or Chinese geomancer following the precepts of feng shui and at virtually all times in their history. The activity spans all times and transcends cultures, and yet it is being done according to a grid pattern of amazing complexity and global extent. When one considers this, a complex and very advanced physics comes into view, and with it the likelihood that one is dealing with the elites that were legacies of a very high and paleo-ancient civilization. We need to only consider the famous site of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The name Angkor, although supposedly a corruption of the Sanskrit word Nagara, town, has a very precise meaning in the ancient Egyptian language. The god Horus lives. Other acceptable translations of Ankh-Hor or Angkor are May Horus live, Horus lives, and Life of Horus.
Angkor Wat in Cambodia.
The placement of the Angkor temples ties them to Egypt in a very direct and unavoidable way. When one studies the placement of various sites and monuments around the world, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan, Tikal, Stonehenge, Avebury, and a host of others too lengthy to mention, that they are placed with Giza as the prime meridian, with that meridian in fact running through the apex of the Great Pyramid itself. Angkor Wat lies at almost exactly 72 degrees east longitude from Giza. That number, 72, requires some special commentary of its own. It is, of course, the exact measure of the spacing between points of a pentagon and pentagram if circumscribed by a circle. The years allowed to the various Hindu yogas, the four great world ages, are all divisible by 72.
1,728,00 years, the Satya Yuga 1,296,000 years, the Treta Yuga 864,000 years, the Dvapara Yuga 432,000 years, the Kali Yuga.
Dividing by 72 gives some very interesting results.
24,000, 18,000, 12,000, 6,000.
The yogas, in other words, are all harmonics or multiples of 72 in the orderly progression of 24, 18, 12, and 6. Interestingly enough, if one deals only with the coefficients of the Hindu yogas, the numbers themselves, by dropping 3 orders of magnitude, then one end up with 1728, 1296, 864, and 432, all numbers which are encoded in the dimension of the temple at Angkor Wat. More are these the only things encoded there. The layout of the temples of Angkor Wat corresponded with the northern constellation of Draco. Thus, there was another correlation to Egypt. For just as the 3 great pyramids of Giza in Egypt model the belt stars of the southern constellation of Orion, so too do the principal monuments of Angkor model the sinuous coils of the northern constellation of Draco. By running astrological programs, alternative researcher Graham Hancock determined that at sunrise of the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, the constellation Draco was due north of the Angkor complex. This corresponded exactly to the date of the 3 major Giza pyramids alignment to the 3 stars of the belt of the constellation Orion 10,500 BC. Both in Cambodia and in Egypt, there was a tradition of an architect of the gods who was responsible for the building of such monuments and who taught architecture to men. In Egypt's case, this was Imhotep. In Cambodia, it was Vishvakarma. Both Egypt and Cambodia venerated the serpent as a sacred figure, and in both cases, it was the hooded cobra that was selected as the archetype. In both cases, it could be depicted in it as a half-human, half-serpent figure. Again, the same holds true for Mesoamerica as well. Both in Egypt and in Cambodia, this serpent god could also symbolize either the sky or the ground. And finally, both in Cambodia and in Egypt, the serpent could symbolize immortality and the cycles of the universe. Both in Cambodia and in Egypt, it was believed that when the king died, his soul would ascend to the heavens. The Incas believed that the soul ascending to heaven after death was accompanied by black dogs, and in Egypt, the soul's ascension was accompanied by Anubis and Upuaut, symbolized by black dogs. The Inca name for Sacsayhuaman means quite literally satisfied falcon. This connects the ancient site in Peru again to Egypt, since the name Falcon is a name of Horus. So many disparate cultures appear to be building massive monuments at different times and places, and yet seem to be doing so as if following some sort of a plan. At Angkor Wat, as at Stonehenge, Giza, Teotihuacan, and so many other places on the world grid, we are confronted with vast structures. Temples, pyramids, monuments, all seemingly laid out in correlation with some astronomical alignment, and all seemingly related to each other, as Angkor Wat's placement at a certain longitude east of the Giza Prime meridian testifies.
Strange activities at grid sites.
Paul Devereux is an Englishman who, along with his Dragon project, has been attempting to conduct scientific investigation into such locations on the grid where local tradition and law ascribes paranormal occurrences to them, including attempts to investigate the infrasonic and infrared properties of such places, which oftentimes returned anomalously high or alternatively low amounts of such sounds and radiations. Devereaux and his team found out that the readings of infrasound or infrared energies often varied with the phases of the moon. In response to the wider celestial geometries, they also discovered anomalies relating to background radioactivity and natural magnetism at certain monuments. Throughout the 20th century, popular rumor has maintained that ancient sacred sites harbor strange powers. The ultimate source of these traditions comes from the ancient belief that the earth was alive, with subtle but powerful forces flowing through its body, the land forces which concentrated themselves according to the spirit of the place, the genius loci. One of the most persistent of these traditions is that movement of conversely immovability is attributed to the stones of such monuments. Stones were said to move to nearby brooks or rivers to drink, or alternatively rise up at certain times of the day, in some cases heralded by the chiming of a nearby clock or certain times of the year. Alternatively, other traditions hold that certain stones cannot be moved at all, or, if they are so displaced, will either return automatically or else cause such problems that the person involved will be obliged to return the stone and will find it supernaturally easy to do so. One may and should, of course, view such traditions with due skepticism for very obvious reasons. But viewed a different way, these traditions are actually describing something having profoundly to do with physics and with the properties of mass and inertia. Other local traditions, at least in Great Britain, hold that some of the stone henges and circles that dot its landscape are populated by stones that refuse all attempt to enumerate or count. Each time a person tries to count them, a different answer will obtain. Similarly, many megaliths or large natural boulders are said, in folklore, to have been placed in their positions by giants of old. Stonehenge itself was once known as the Giant's Dance, and similarly, the stone circles of Sangali in far-off Africa were said by local tribal traditions to be built by ancient people who were 8 meters tall. Yet another famous megalithic site, Baalbek in Lebanon, whose 1,000-ton-plus stone, Trilithon, was according to tradition said to have been built by Cain and an ancient giant race. While this association of megalithic sites with giants is not universal, it does have echoes in places as diverse as Mesoamerica, South America, and Egypt, where similar giant stone constructions are attributed to the gods or to the giants, or associated with them in some other fashion. In other traditions, disturbing stones in effect, desecrating them are associated with various curses for doing so, among which are that the desecrator can expect to be subjected to severe weather conditions such as freak winds or fierce electrical storms.
And there are also examples in the modern record of this actually happening.
In 1849, for instance, when Dean Merewether of Hereford and his team were digging at Silbury Hill near Avebury in Wiltshire, a dramatic high Gothic thunderstorm broke out, and men working deep within the great mound felt it shudder to its base. They noticed that the significantly timed storm was much to the satisfaction of the rustics.
Silbury Hill, Avebury.
Similarly, in 1940, a farmer approaching the so-called Hobgoblin Stone near Lampeter in Wales, with the intention of breaking it up to make gateposts, was subjected to a violent thunderstorm which pursued the man as he ran for his home. There are also other legends suggesting that these monuments are animated and connected with life in other fashions, including traditions ascribing healing, virility, and fertility to various stones in such monuments. In the case of the traditions of the American Pueblo Indians, there are legends connecting such sacred sites to the flow of energies between this plane of reality and other concurrent realities, as a kind of gateway or door between worlds of one reality or another. This is also reflected further south in the legends of the Maya and Aztecs, and also in Mesopotamia, where the very name Babel or Babylon means literally door or gate of the gods. All of this suggests that we are looking at not just entirely unrelated legends and lore about such places, but rather at dim memories of their possible purpose and function, a purpose that was, moreover, attributable to some kind of function for such monuments beyond enshrining certain measures and astronomical alignments. They are strongly suggestive of an underlying technological purpose and meaning. They suggest we are looking at cogs in a vast machine. This is made more evident when one turns to consider one of the more widespread traditions associated with such sites, that of strange radiations. From the pyramids to Giza to those of Mexico, and from the henges and earthworks of Britain to those of North America and continental Europe, there are abundant traditions that associate the presence of strange lights or glowing aura around such monuments. No one, for example, who has studied the lore associated with Giza in Egypt or Teotihuacan in Mexico can help but encounter such stories, for they are numerous and plentiful. In one sense, this is entirely to be expected in the case of the massive stone pyramids of Mesoamerica and Egypt, for the piezoelectric properties of quartz under stress are phenomena that are regularly scientifically studied. Quartz crystals, when shattered or subjected to stress, give off minute bursts of electricity, which show up as sparks of light. And the massive structure of the Great Pyramid, composed of enormous amounts of limestone and granite, both types of rock embedding tiny quartz crystals, is certainly in one sense a gigantic piezoelectric capacitor. So in one sense, such stories are to be expected, for the phenomenon is now well known to science. Yet, this does not exhaust the anomalous nature of what sometimes is encountered at such sites. For example, Devereux uncovered evidence that Native American Indians were familiar with concentrations of natural radioactivity and even marked such sites with distinctive petroglyphs. This led Devereux into a very interesting line of speculation, a line of speculation mingling various versions of shamanistic tradition and lore with modern science. He began by noting that in places of abnormally high background concentrations of radiation, often associated with such ancient grid sites, many people experience some form of heightened awareness or increased consciousness. This, he hypothesized, is due to some sort of unknown or little understood relationship between radiation and consciousness, a relationship he calls radiation CSI. This is not as wild as it first might seem, for the Canadian neurologist Michael Persinger published a paper in the June 1995 professional journal Perceptual and Motor Skills, entitled On the Possibility of Accessing Every Human Brain by Electromagnetic Induction of Fundamental Algorithms. Additionally, there is a solid argument to be made that at least some temples of the much later classical period relied explicitly on the knowledge of radio engineering principles, in part for long-distance communications purposes and in part for the possible manipulation of emotional and mental states. In Persinger's case, the induction of visions and memories is produced by a special helmet which beams powerfully concentrated magnetic fields into a person's brain.
Excerpt from Contact Report 001, My First UFO Sighting and the First Subsequent Contact.
Towards the end of the get-together, he asked me to lie back in my chair, after which he then put a strange construction made up of countless wires and the smallest of apparatuses, etc., around my head. Wondering what was to follow, I watched him quietly as he worked with the apparatuses, with buttons and switches, and suddenly I heard and saw tremendous things inside of me. Everything was just suddenly in me, a tremendous amount of knowledge, cognition, and all sorts of other things. I felt as if all of a sudden, strange forces had penetrated into me, as I was suddenly able to recognize things and events of the future, wanted to cure human beings of illnesses through whatever powers, and many other things. Then these influences stopped abruptly, and Svath removed the strange device from my head, with the explanation that I would now have all the abilities which had been given to me through the apparatus.
For Devereux, the implications of so many people having such experiences at so many ancient sites are clear, for they imply that physical energy effects were deliberately and opportunistically employed at ritual sites, making them simply one part of an ancient technology of consciousness manipulation that included initiatory ordeals, ritual activity, dancing, drumming, sensory deprivation, the use of drugs, and even the nature of the sites themselves. For Devereux, all of this is a manifestation of the continuance within various local law and tradition in Great Britain of the ancient Druidic philosophy of the prime matter, the physical medium itself. The Druids laid out all their sacred sites along straight lines, so as the Chinese did. The whole landscape of Britain has been laid out to a celestial pattern. Every hill has its astrological meaning, every district its centre of symmetry from which its hidden nature can be divined. The Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, and Baal, the ancient sun god, memorialized in place names along this ancient grid. Thoth was known as Theutates by the Druids, and Baal found in Ball Hill, and there is even a Baalbeg, shades of Baalbek, as the name of the deserted Scottish village above Loch Ness. And hundreds of Toot or Tot hills can be found dotting the British landscapes, testifying to Thoth. Devereux began to understand that he was looking at more than just a philosophy confined to megalithic sites in northwestern Europe and Great Britain. At these monuments we are in the presence of technology, the impressive remains left by a group of races who were the founders of what has become today's Western culture, which has put its stamp, indeed has stamped, over most of the world. For Devereux, this technology was designed to manipulate some life force, the power of the physical medium itself. It could be accumulated and controlled to some extent, and esoteric technologies were developed to this end. In short, we are looking at an alchemical technology, an alchemical architecture whose very blueprint is the entire grid itself.
Worth knowing.
There are legends, as mentioned above, suggesting that these monuments, like for example Stonehenge, etc., are connected with healing, virility, and fertility, and as we can see from the Contact Report 469, these stories are not just legends and sayings.
Excerpt from Contact Report 469.
Merlin lured Gorlois away from his castle on a pretext in order for Uther Pendragon to secretly snatch Igerna at night and bring her to Tintagel. A confidant of Merlin, who was also a servant to the Queen Igerna of Cornwall, then administered a drug to her, and she reached a hallucinogenic and will-less state. Igerna was kidnapped from the castle and taken to a certain place where Uther Tudor Pendragon and several male and female druids were already assembled under Merlin's leadership. Inside the circle they formed, Uther and the drugged will-less, Igerna performed the procreation. From their union, Arthur Artus Arthus was born on the 4th of January 469.
On these so-called grid sites, particularly strong Earth electromagnetic oscillations prevail. That is, that these places work for humans like amplifiers of the thought waves. If a person enters these places thus, for example, in a bad mood, then its mood becomes worse. If it is, however, contrary in a good mood, then its mood improves there. Each intention or thought is sent out with double, triple, or tenfold strength, and hit the respective person again with the same intensity. So if you want to manifest something, these so-called grid sites are the perfect places for it. Adolf Hitler had devised a special ritual for the members of the Nazi SS by ordering newly married SS men to deflower their young wives on old German cemeteries, which were built on such places where strong earth electromagnetic vibrations prevailed. In this way, he believed that in their children old German heroes would be reborn. So something similar could have played a role in the procreation of King Arthur.
Excerpt from Contact Report 386.
As you know, the center is located at a place in which, from time to time, particularly strong Earth electromagnetic swinging waves make themselves noticeable, which strongly influence the body, the psyche and the consciousness of the human being, whereby his or her impulses in regard to thoughts and feelings shift into uncontrolled courses and can, aus arten, get badly out of control of the good human nature into exaggerated and uncontrolled actions.